All right, so let's move on and talk about how we actually go about passing this signal on from our presynaptic neuron to our postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so first off, we get an action potential coming to the end of the presynaptic neuron, right? That's the signal that we want to pass on to the postsynaptic cell, okay? I do want to kind of point out that as that action potential arrives at the terminal, we already have synaptic vesicles here hanging out in the axon terminal that have those neurotransmitter molecules in them. Okay, so that's they're kind of always there and they're just waiting for a signal to tell them to be released. Okay, once we depolarize the axon terminal, we open these channels that are here. Okay, so in the axon terminal, we have voltage gated calcium channels. When the axon terminal gets depolarized, that opens the voltage gated calcium channels and calcium will move into the axon terminal. So you might remember, or maybe you don't, that extracellular calcium is really high, intracellular calcium is really low. So that's going to provide the driving force to move calcium into the axon terminal from the extracellular fluid. Another way to think about it is that calcium has an equilibrium potential of positive 122 millivolts. So if we are depolarizing the axon terminal, we're only going to depolarize it to like maybe plus 30, plus 40 millivolts. Calcium still wants the inside of the cell to be even higher than that. So it's going to move into the cell, okay? All right, once we have calcium moving into the synaptic terminal here, that triggers the release of neurotransmitter from the synaptic vesicles. So we get exocytosis happening, neurotransmitter gets released into the synaptic cleft. That neurotransmitter is going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and it's going to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. And finally, once we bind a receptor on the postsynaptic cell, that's going to lead to some kind of response in the postsynaptic cell, which we will talk about that later. We'll talk about the kinds of responses that we can get, okay? So that basically covers the steps of synaptic transmission. Just to give you a chance to breathe and kind of process this, I would like you to take a look at this list of events and place them in order. So what order do these occur in the steps of synaptic transmission? So go ahead, hit pause and work that out. All right, so hopefully you came up with this, right? First, an action potential is going to reach the synaptic terminal. That's going to depolarize the membrane and open voltage-gated calcium channels. That then is going to allow calcium to enter the synaptic terminal. Once we have calcium entering the synaptic terminal, that is going to trigger exocytosis of the synaptic vesicles, and it's going to release neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. That neurotransmitter is then going to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And then finally, we're going to get our response in the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. Okay, so here's another question for you. I just would like you to kind of take a look at this whole overall process and think about the fact that you can block communication between your presynaptic cell and your postsynaptic cell. There are lots of ways to do that. What I would like you to do now is take a look at this figure, think about the processes, and come up with one way, one thing that you could do to block that communication. Okay, so go ahead and write that down. Okay, so hopefully you came up with something. We're going to discuss what people came up with when we meet up for class.